Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Corey. It's a pleasure to welcome our guest today, as well as a point of pride to have him visit Brigham Young University. I first met Dominique Kalifa 3 years ago when he, his wife Agnès, and 2 children, Jules and Adele, were on a trip to the western United States that took them from California through Las Vegas and the Intermountain West. Part of this trip involved a makeshift slip and slide in my backyard as kids. But the most enduring image of that trip was of the Kalifas camping in a rural Wyoming KOA, where they were welcomed to a campfire gathering with hoedown and storytelling. They were reliving the adventures of 19th century French trappers working in this area, like the Étienne Provost, whose name our city bears. Dominique Kalifa is professor of contemporary history at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, as Corey Leonard mentioned, where he co-directs its dynamic Centre d'Histoire du 19e, the Center for the History of the 19th Century. A specialist of cultural history, he has published extensively on a variety of topics, but his archival work focuses on the history and social imaginaries of crime, as he investigates why our modern societies find such a need to consume representations of vice. Notable among his publications are A History of Private Detectives and the relation between crime stories and French culture during the Belle Époque, the end of the 19th century. Today's lecture is part of a 2-week visit, the core of which is a mini-seminar on the history of the French bas-fond, or underworld. Professor Kalifa holds a joint appointment at the prestigious Institut d'études politiques in Paris, Sciences Po, where he teaches a course on the history of modern French political thought. Please join me in welcoming our guest today.
Thank you, Daryl, for this too kind presentation. And I would like to thank BYU also for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, and really I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to show you some of my recent work. So the lecture of today is called Biribi, which is a strange word. I suppose that none of you have heard this strange word before, and that its meaning remains obscure. But don't worry. It's also the case in France, where this completely forgotten word is nowadays incomprehensible for most people. Nevertheless, it was a very common and very well-known expression in the late 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century. For every young Frenchman who had to give, at that time, 2 or 3 years of his life for conscription as a draftsman, Biribi was the popular and generic name given to the diverse disciplinary and penitentiary institutions of the French army, and I suppose the subtitle will be more comprehensible for you. It was a very complicated world, a complex world made of different corps and units, but unified by a common localization in North Africa, which was at that time part of the French colonial empire, and also unified by a very harsh regime, in fact an awful and barbarous regime, which made Biribi into the symbol of the French state's military oppression. More oddly, until now, until the book I published last spring, no books or no academic research had been dedicated to this topic. And my research was the first one which tried to trace this system. This lack of academic research is in itself worth thinking over, in the same way as the lack of studies upon our colonial experience. However, many sources are available. The military archives in Paris, in the Château de Vincennes, provides a lot of documents which allow us to understand the framework of that system and its development. It's also possible, I didn't do it, it's a titanic task, to undertake a kind of prosopography of all these young soldiers, for the troops register and the prison register have been preserved. Many books written by physicians, criminologists, lawyers, many newspapers, especially at the turn of 19th and 20th century, give us a lot of information. Above all, we can also use the very large number of popular songs, broadsheets, dime novels. You can have a sample of that, story papers which are devoted to Biribi, which was a main theme of our popular European culture in the early 20th century. Of course, I will not evoke all these aspects in this short talk, but I would like to present briefly the structure of this disciplinary system, the reasons why it emerged as a public and specific concern at the turn of 19th and 20th century, and why it became a main theme, a main issue within the French popular culture. It also provides a topic for the discussion of the importance of the colonial experience in the making of French contemporary identity. Let's begin with the first theme. I quote, "No country has so many penitentiary institutions as France," wrote the famous criminologist Alexandre Lacassagne in 1910. And the manifold surveys conducted at the same moment by the Ministry of War show that no European state had such a complex system, so a complicated jumble of institutions, corps, units, places. This was the result of a complex military and colonial history, but also a preference for policies which juxtapose or piled up institutions rather than reforming them. That's a very Latin political tradition. Around 1910, which is a year which provides us a good view of this question, as we will see later, this system, Biribi, included at least 5 main bodies, and I try to realize a sketch which is difficult, complex, but I will try to find it. So, this is, yeah. The first of all of this began with what we call disciplinary section of the French army, in French, Compagnie Discipline, founded very early, as you can see in 1818, as a part of the famous Gouvion-Saint-Cyr Act, which was an act which reorganized the French army just after the Napoleonic Wars. And what were these units? They were just strictly disciplinary units. They received the bad soldiers, the wool soldiers, the rebels, those who appeared impervious to discipline, the drunkards, and so on. In theory, the soldiers were sent there when all the regular penalties had been used up, and after a decision taken by a unit council. But, and it's very important to insist upon that point, they had committed neither crime nor offense. There were no legal motive for the sentence except their continual bad behavior. It was a kind of additional punishment, and for an undetermined period. There were, as you can see, 2 levels. First, fusillés, then, for the worst of these men, pionniers. This later corps included also the soldiers who had committed acts of self-mutilation. These sections were at first located in France, but as soon as the conquest of North Africa began, so they were relocated in the new colony. The second component, here, 1832, Bataillon d'Infanterie Légère d'Afrique, African Battalion, was very different. They were created in 1832 and they started in Algeria when they took part in the War of Conquest. It was a different corps, a fighting unit, the disciplinary were not fighting units, who received soldiers just coming out military jails or coming out disciplinary section. It was a kind of testing unit where the discipline was harder and where the former bad soldiers had to prove they deserve now to join regular corps. There were no legal limit to the state, so, and generally, the soldiers stayed there, remained there till the end of their enlistment. The third body, this one, was in a way very more common. It was made up of the different military convicts sentenced by a military court for a crime or an offense established clearly by the military code of justice. They were sent after a trial to military jail for short penalties, penitentiary for longer penalties, or in ateliers travaux publics, which were a special military a special military sentence. Their situation is therefore very different from the other because these soldiers had been sentenced by a court. We can discern finally 2 final groups composed of two very weird and very hybrid units. Where are they? Here. Compagnie disciplinaire des colonies. Colonial disciplinary section, founded in 1860, with a very complex status. It was in fact the highest level of disciplinary sanction, to which could be sent, of course, without trial, the worst soldiers of the previous section. That means that there were mixed sentenced and non-sentenced soldiers, who were, and all the soldiers who were seen by the hierarchy as perverse, vicious, degenerate. And finally, the last court excluded of the army, very weird name, the section of excluded soldiers. As many other, the French law stipulated that if you had committed a crime and been sentenced for that, you lost your civil right and became, therefore, unworthy of serving in the army. But as a rule of equality, the young convicts, at the end of their civil punishment, had to fulfill their legal conscription in this section of excluded soldiers. I quote, "The excluded had paid his debt to the society, he has now to pay his debt to the homeland," the journalist Albert Long wrote in 1928. As you can see, there was not institutional unity in this system, no real cohesion, not any real cohesion. To face the scandals which appeared around 1910, murders in a disciplinary camp, and the strong contestation which followed, a committee was instituted to think about and prepare a reform bill. But it failed to reorganize the system and disappeared in 1912. However, the public opinion expressed a clear awareness that these units form a single and consistent world. I quote, "The general public, including the same reprobation, the African battalion, the disciplinary section, the prison, penitentiary, and Anti-militarism public, even the section of excluded soldiers," the medical officer Louis Combe wrote in 1912. Another quotation, "What in a world we call Biribi," to point out the military penal colony, Dr. Lacassagne added. There were, in fact, I think, five many reasons to consider these different units as a whole. The first reason is the rule of double punishment. Except for the soldiers who were got sentenced by a court, all the others have already paid for the offenses and thus receive a kind of additional and undetermined penalty. As the French socialist leader Jean Jaurès declared in the parliament in March 1910, I quote, "It means adding to the sentence he has already served a new punishment." The second point, the second reason to consider them as a whole, is of course Africa. You have a map of 1920. Biribi is in Africa. So began the famous and popular song of Aristide Bruand in 1890. In fact, as I said it before, the first disciplinary sections were not located in the colonial empire, but as soon as began the conquest of Algeria, so began also the progressive relocation of this unit to Algeria. This movement was rather slow at the beginning for financial, budgetary reasons. But by 1865, the 10 disciplinary sections were settled in North Africa. It was, of course, the case of the African battalion, whose natural vocation was fighting for colonization. They were also employed in Mexico and also employed in Tonkin. The case was different for the military jails, for many of them were located in the metropole. But all the ateliers travaux publics were located in North Africa. Here I try to locate more precisely the main implantation, location. A section of excluded soldiers were also from the beginning settled in Algeria in several locations. Outside of Algeria, but not outside of the empire, were the colonial disciplinary section located in Senegal and Madagascar. This African project became more and more pronounced. In 1858, for instance, the young draftees exempted by the African battalion for good conduct, for instance, were reintegrated into the Army of Africa. I quote, Such measures turned the Army of Africa into an army of punishment, the General Governor of Algiers complained. In North Africa itself, a clear movement progressively sent the prisoners and the punished soldiers to the south, toward the desert. How can we explain this progressive Africanization? The military reasons are not really relevant, except in the case of the African battalion, which play a role in the conquest. But all of the other units were non-fighting units. The colonial arguments are more serious. Military convicts were employed to undertake various works of colonial development, building roads, bridges, harbors, fortification, draining or drying out marshy areas. Some of them were also loaned for short periods to farmers or private enterprises. But the productivity of this penal manpower continually decreased, and its utility seems to be very weak at the end of the 19th century. Breaking loose stones under the sun became the symbol of this useless work. The initial ideas of regeneration by work, colonization, and military values quickly faded. The main reason remained isolation, exclusion, deportation, banishment, in harmony with the civil penal policy, which relocated at the same time the structure of hard labor, which were at the beginning in France, in some harbors in France, to Guyana and New Caledonia. Policies which the criminologist Gabriel Tab ironically called the French exports. For the military hierarchy, the colonial location had two main advantages. On the one hand, it protected the rest of the French army from contamination by the perverse element. On the other, it guaranteed harder repression, thanks to distance, weather, hard labor, and so on. For the soldiers, Africa was synonymous with suffering, seen as a place outside of the law. Ill treatment, murders, torture were so frequent there, they say, because of its colonial location. I quote, "We can be sure that if the disciplinary section were in the mainland, near great urban centers under the control of the public opinion, such acts of cruelty would be impossible." A former disciplinary soldier wrote in 1901. I quote again, "Africa was the cursed land, the land of slavery, of exile, and of torture," a dying novelist wrote 10 years later. These images figured very significant in French popular representation of the colonial world as a land of punishment. Third point, a common organization. We don't have to imagine these places as permanent concrete jail or building. All of these units were organized in the same way. The headquarters, Guera in Algeria, for the command, for the mail, for the supplies, and mobile camps, named Detachment of Discipline. You have two pictures. Small groups of 10 or 15 prisoners under the command of a warrant officer scattered around the central camp according to the work or the mission they have to complete. In 1901, for instance, in Tunisia alone, we can count more than 22 camps, mobile camps. The perfect panopticon, to speak like Michel Foucault. Discipline camps dotted all around the country, but also it's denial, because they were actually impossible to control. That also means that no cartography of Biribi appears possible. This setup has two other main consequences: a more pronounced feeling of loneliness and isolation. Africa was identified with desert, boulders, and loose stones, and the complete and often despotic power of a warrant officer upon a small group helped by native infantrymen, which were an additional humiliation for the French prisoners. Always described as cruel torturers, sergeant and corporal were accused of inflicting bad treatment and inventing punishment with the most complete impunity. This treatment and this impunity can be seen as another common point. In fact, Biribi was above all, for the French opinion, synonymous with hell on earth, and its description looked like an awful horror gallery. The usual measures of penitentiary repression were of course used: cell, solitary confinement, chain, and irons. We have a representation of irons, officially only in case of fear or rage. deprivation of food and water, blows and corporal punishment, officially forbidden in 1850. But we have to add the specific ill treatment of the African army, whose symbols were le tombeau, the tomb. In fact, as you can see here at the bottom, a small camping tent where the prisoner lay on the ground. But in Africa, that means with the head exposed during the day to the blazing sun and to the freezing weather at night. Also, la crapaudine, how can I translate crapaudine? It means something like the position of the frog. Hands and feet tied in the back, often hanging on a pole and completed by a gun. And le silo, I don't have any picture of le silo, a round hole in the ground used by the Arabs as a corn loft and used by the detachment as a cell. But the worst was the provocation of the prisoner by some warrant officer. You can have here some very presentation. A common script was to order a soldier to the peloton. What was the peloton? It was, in fact, the first. That meant to run with the backpack, very hard backpack, and then to order him to run, to wait then until he became exhausted and stop running, and then to give him the order again and certify that the soldier's refusal to obey, an offense which sent him directly to a military court. This was called in the military slang to make somebody turn, and sent him for 6 months or 1 year in an atelier de travaux publics. What was the advantage for the sergeant? It was that he could spend a couple of days in a main town, Alger, Oran, or Tunis, where the military court were sat. In other cases, this kind of persecution drove some soldiers to self-mutilation in order to change from its unit to crime or to escape. The result was more often a bullet in the back shot by the infantrymen who kept watch over the camp. It's difficult to assess the extent of such practices, denied, of course, by the military authorities and overrepresented by literature, newspapers, and military and anti-militarist propaganda. The last reason to consider all these units as a whole, and which gave a strong unity to all these corps, was that they worked as a chain, as a system, as a vicious circle. It was rather easy, once entered in another of these corps, to spend a long time running around what I call the archipelago. Let's imagine you were sent for too many illegal absences or drunkenness that were the most frequent motive to a section of discipline. There, another problem very easily leads to you being sent quickly from the fusilier to the second level, to the pionnier, and little was necessary then to be sent to a military court, refusal to obey, insulting behavior, or destruction of sale of military goods that were the main offensive. From here, you were sent for 6 months or 1 year into an atelier de travaux publics. When you get out of the atelier, you were directly enlisted in the bataillon d'Afrique, in the African battalion, where it was easy, once again, to be sent to a section of discipline, or, in the worst cases, to the colonial section of discipline. This was Biribi. A kind of parallel system of punishment, closely tied to the ordinary one, but often seen as a very closed world, a place of nowhere and a place of no right, a kind of dystopia somewhere in Africa, an unidentified land of nightmares whose exit was only found through mutilation, death, or crime. To kill a warrant officer, for instance, hoping to escape the death penalty and to be sentenced to hard labor in Guyana, which was seen by many soldiers as preferable as Biribi, because you have the idea that you can escape from Guyana, but it was not possible to escape from Biribi. It seems difficult to fix precisely when this punitive landscape found its general form. We may consider that the end of the Second Empire, 1860, 1870, as an important moment. There were now a new code of military justice in 1857, the creation of the colonial disciplinary section, the extension of the program of colonization in North Africa. Moreover, the word Biribi appears in 1860 with that meaning in a detective novel published in 1861. It was Biribi. It was before the name of an Italian game, a kind of bingo played in France in the mid-17th century. But we really have to wait until the 90s to see Biribi emerging as a strong and important concern. The reason for this outbreak point out some specific feature of French culture in relation to the army, to the colonial empire, and to mass culture. Numbers can give us a first set of reasons. It's not easy. It was very difficult for me to get these numbers. It's not easy to get a clear idea of the number of soldiers staying or sent to Biribi. But some statistical documents available up to 1913 can give an account of the number of soldiers sent each year. If we don't remark any strong shift in the number of soldiers sent to the section of discipline, an average number of 1,000 each year, and to the Atelier Travaux Publics, an average number of 1,500 across the whole period, we can see here, oh no, I'm sorry. We can see, maybe, on the last sketch, on the last diagram, a very impressive shift, a very important change that modifies the curve for the African battalion at the end of the 80s. It doubles from an average number of 3 to 4,000 to an average number of 7 to 8,000 soldiers each year. There is two reasons, two explanations for this impressive shift. The first concerns the military law of 1889, which sent a new category of soldiers to the African battalion. Up to that law, as I told it before, they received soldiers who were getting out military jail or getting out disciplinary section. But the fifth article of the new law, 1889, stipulated that every young draftee who had been sentenced before his conscription, that means as a civilian, for a civilian offense and by a civilian court, to a punishment of more than 3 months of jail, or who was in jail at the very moment of his conscription, was automatically sent in an African battalion for the whole time of his military service. It was, of course, a very unfair law, the typical example of what I have called before double punishment. The second explanation, and of course the consequence was a very important increase of the number of soldiers sent to the African battalion. The second explanation refers to the idea of the French army. The French Revolution had inaugurated the army of citizens and had made of conscription one of the main expressions and symbols of citizenship and nationhood. But through the idea remained, its enforcement was seriously limited by the political regime which followed. In fact, we have to wait till 1889, that law, to have really the suppression of all the exceptions. And from 1889, every young Frenchman had to go as a draftee in the army. It's the beginning of the conscription as something very forced. And the army as a personal and universal service. This fiction of equality, of universality, which was one of the foundations of the Republican philosophy, supposed that no one could escape from military service. It explained, for instance, this odd institution of the excluded of the army that I've told before. But the limits of the principle were obvious. Class distinctions were marked, and the new organization of the African battalion in 1889, a very Republican date, 1 century after the French Revolution, had also clear intention. The service was universal, but it was necessary to trace a clear line between the honest citizens and those who, between the honest citizens and the bad guys, between the young draftee from the countryside and the loose, the hooligans, and those who would be called Apaches after 1902. While some Republican philanthropists like Felix Voisin imagined the army could be a way to regenerate juvenile offenders, the army instead created special units dedicated in the name of equality to the removal from the healthy body of the nation of the perverse and tainted elements believed to corrupt it. I think we can see there a very over expression of the fiction of the French Republican model of equality and of integration. But the idea was also, back to Michel Foucault and to the Panopticon, to link the civilian penal system and the military, extending in a way the first into the second, leaving nobody outside, taking the advantage to spread military norms and military values amongst the underworld. But this law, 1889, deeply changed the nature of the African battalion, formerly composed of turbulent and undisciplinary guys, but professional soldiers, to a new unit composed of drafted, coming up civilian shades. It is difficult to know whether all young draftees sent to African battalion or disciplinary section were such hooligans. It was quite easy in late 19th century France to be sentenced to 3 months of jail. A common theft, vagrancy, or a brawl were enough. However, it's a fact that more and more young Frenchmen could experience Biribi. Some actually did, others were only afraid to, but the idea took root in the public opinion that a part of the army was full of rude boys and of criminals, Apaches in the army, as some newspapers headed around 1910. Biribi has become a real concern. This concern was also the result of a very strong anti-militarism activism. We know the importance of anti-militarism during the first half of the Third Republic. For the revolutionary movement, which we knew in the 80s, the army was the main target. It had crushed the Paris Commune in 1871. It was used to repress strikes or worker demonstrations in Fourmi, north of France, on May the 1st of 1890. Soldiers shot into the crowd. It was considered to be the arm of capitalism by a revolutionary movement in which anarchists and anarcho-syndicalism currents were dominant. Biribi appears first as a product of anti-militarism, a movement ready to fight. We can really say that the public awareness of Biribi appears with Georges Darrien's novel, Biribi, Discipline Militaire, first published in 1990. It's a very, the first cover. Biribi is the novel of Darrien. It's a very difficult novel which transposes the personal experiences of the novelist from 1883 to 1886 in the 5th disciplinary section settled in Gaza in Tunisia. It's a very long exposure of the ill treatment, the cruelty, and the torture inflicted to the soldier in this section. Men are not described as vicious or criminal in that novel, but they are described as ordinary men broke down by fear, hunger, moral and physical suffering. I quote, animals who can see the sledgehammer that is going to kill them coming and who can't avoid it. This novel and its adaptation on stage played a very important role in the public debate which began in the last decade of 19th century. Other books followed. Revolutionary newspaper also published very frequent special issues on Biribi. They argued that anarchists or militants were the main targets of that military repression and were directly sent to North Africa. The papers gave personal news of those who are there and suffering the military oppression. It's very difficult to verify in the archives whether Biribi was or was not used as an instrument against the revolutionary movement. Most soldiers sent to Biribi belonging, of course, to the popular classes, and many cases appear of leftist militants sent by the command in African battalion, but other documents or reports insist on the fact that nobody could be sent there for political reasons. In fact, many trade unionists and many revolutionary militants had been sentenced for small offenses, like brawls, illegal demonstration, and so on, and thus were legally sent to the African battalion. During the revolt of the wine growers, very famous in 1910 in France, the famous 17th Infantry who refused to use their weapon against peasants was collectively sent to Garza in Tunisia. And the main upheavals took place in 1910 after the murder of a former trade unionist, Albert Arnoux, who had been killed by a sergeant in the disciplinary section of an African battalion. The great debate which took place at that time carried, for a short time, a very large movement against the awful regime used in the African military hard labor. But for the revolutionary movement, it was also a means to criticize the French left, which 10 years ago was mobilized to defend another victim of the military justice, I mean Alfred Dreyfus. The same man now formed the government and led innocent victims to be tortured and killed by the same military justice. You can see the headline of this paper, Au profiteur de l'affaire Dreyfus. Arnoux' case, quickly called the Worker Dreyfus case, was an important moment. The result was the reform of the disciplinary section, renamed Section Spéciale, and relocated in the mainland, in fact, in some peripheral islands, Oléron and Corsica. But nothing changed really in their organization, and nothing changed really for the other units, African Battalion of Atelier Travaux Publics, which remained in North Africa. Was the public denunciation of bad treatment the main reasons for this debate? Can we perceive here a kind of threshold of sensibilities, a kind of growing intolerance against violence and arbitrary practices? That is not so sure. The anti-militarist books and newspapers were maybe too prolific to be trusted. They were just long lists of horrific descriptions, looking more like the Grand Guignol theater, which gave each night scenes of terror on stage, than like realistic indictment against the army. But main newspapers were also an instrument for this public campaign, and they also played an important role in the denunciation of Biribi. Reports started to appear in 1902 with Charles Vallier report in a very ordinary paper, La Vie Illustrée, a kind of familial newspaper, La Vie Illustrée, and that began, you can see a picture of a man à la Craponie, which, of course, is not a real picture, but it's possible to take it's just a reconstitution. And the theme, the issue became very important in 1907, where very famous reporter like Jacques Dur in very popular newspapers gave a series of reports entitled Military Hard Labor. These papers gave rise to an important debate, but they focused too much on torture and atrocities with a certain complaisance to have really consequences. In fact, newspapers' representation quickly took the direction of a pathetic and exotic exploration and exploitation of the dregs of society and of the dregs of the army. A new way, in fact, to go slamming and to describe the underworld. As all famous gangsters were former soldiers of the African battalion, such reports were very frequent in the papers and magazines during the interwar period. You can have such example, Police magazine, which presented that kind of reports. This focus on extreme behavior and on social exoticism was also useful to justify the whole system once clear of its main abuses. Mass culture shows here its ambiguity and how fake denunciation can conceal real acceptance. But one exception may be quoted: the famous reports of Albert Long, one of the most famous reporters in French history. His report entitled Dante has seen nothing, Dante n'avait rien vu, Biribi, played a very great role in the closing, and you can see here the reporter Albert Long played a great role in the closing of the Atelier Travaux Publics in 1928. But Long was an exceptional reporter whose books on the hard labor in Guyana, for instance, had also a very strong impact. But this concept about Biribi, and that's the will be my last point, was also the result of a very deep and prolific imaginary made of songs, dime novels, pulp fiction, newspaper reports, which emerged precisely at that turn of the century. From the same year, 1890, emerged a very deep system of representation made of popular songs, what we call in France realistic songs, or poetry of the underworld, kind of sad and fatalistic stories of prostitutes, of street loves, of tragic destinies, which always end on the scaffold, in the hard labor of Guyana or in Biribi. A master of that kind of poetry was Aristide Bruant, a very famous singer. You can have here a very famous singer who sang in 1890 Biribi or Obadaf. Badaf was the nickname of African battalion. And these songs were very famous. Pulp and cheap novels follow, some examples, Biribi, another Irréprouvé, and magazines. And a large amount of such novels were published until World War II. Many reports in newspapers and magazines belong also, as I mentioned it before, to the same trust. The content of this narrative is important. It helps us to explain the large diffusion of Biribi imaginary in the early 20th century and provides also some reason to understand its acceptance by French society. Three main themes can be seen in that production. It's first a scenery. Africa as a land of desolation, as a place of nowhere, just like Biribi, which as a place does not exist anywhere. A land whose shape only appears as a symbolic landscape of raw sand, stones, and sun. It's an anonymous place. I quote, one of the places which has known no change from the creation of the earth, a journalist wrote. A place without identification, where everything is equal, where nothing exists. A place with no names, or weird names, for Frenchmen of the early 19th century. What does Catherine, Soukelarba, Le Caisse, Faunassa for the French people mean? All these narratives represent North Africa as a physical and moral desert, sterility of the landscape. Always the same, loneliness of the African night, a land of desolation, but with a very strong power of evocation. I quote, Biribi, Africa, loads of stones, bless Sandras in his novel La Main Coupée. It's the realm of the desert, as the early 20th century shaped it. A vanished and forgotten world. It's as described in Pierre Benoit's novel L'Atlantide or in Jacques Ferrer's movie in 1921. A land of pain and suffering. Even the main towns, Alger or Oran, where the bad guys tried nostalgically to reconstitute the Parisian society, appeared like lost world, whose centers seemed to be the harbor and the boat going back to France. A scenery, but also a sociology, a world of men and of masculinity. There are no women in Biribi except some prostitutes lost in shabby brothels. A world of brutal force and of violence, the violence of ill-treatment, of course, but also the violence of the society of men, the tyranny of the caste, the humiliation of the weak. This is a land of absolute and extreme contrast. For a popular culture which made of physical strength and sexual domination major symbol of identity, we can imagine how such experiences were lived and understood by men. That's why the experience of Biribi was often erased from the memory of this man. Better speak of what happened before, the excitement of the trip to Africa, and of what came after. That's also why these narratives were always told in a very impressive way. They describe a mysterious world blurred with sun vapors. They are like unstable representation. Back to poetry, an old and fierce poetry, wrote Pierre Macorlan, who created the notion of social fantastic to restitute this representation. A scenery, a sociology, and third, a destiny that we can summarize with the expression coined by the journalist Marcel Montaron, I quote, the taste for misfortune and adversity, all these narratives spread out the same idea: failure, fatality, and an identity marked by unhappiness. That's why the nickname of the soldiers of the battalion, of the African battalion, is in French le joyeux, the happy man. My life is made for pain and suffering. I have to accept it. I have to accept my fate. We are doomed by failure. This is the constant message these songs and novels give. That is one of the ways taken by popular and mass culture in the early 20th century. But this was not only a poetic and literary motif. The men of Biribi wrote it directly on their own bodies. The tattoos, which was the great affair of Biribi, wrote the 20th century picture, wrote the same story directly on their skin, like voluntary stigmata, fatalitas. No choice. Souvenir the memories of Biribi, but also bad luck, no luck, born to suffer, etc., etc. Africa and Biribi were just bad state in bad destinies. 3 very short remarks at the conclusion. First, we are very far away from the heroic representation of the greater France, the France of the empire. Biribi provides a very sad, very dark, very cursed vision of colonization as a land and an experience of desolation. This vision had been largely spread out and shared. First, because this imaginary conveyed by these songs, novels, movies, and so on, had known a very large diffusion. And second, because this experience of Biribi was shared by many, many, many men. From 1890 to 1930, we can say that 6 to 8,000 men were sent each year to one or another of these units. From 1880, the beginning, to World War II, between 600,000 and 800,000 men have made the experience of Biribi. By comparison, the civilian hard labor of Guyana had received at the same time just 100,000. So that means 6 to 8 more times. Second, for the same reason, Biribi was also a kind of laboratory where men completed their apprenticeship of violence and of extreme behavior. Once free, some of them imported such practices into the society of French criminals and gangsters, where the caïd were the king, while others exported their knowledge of humiliation and torture against the native during the war of decolonization. And third, mass culture, which was very important in the topic, shows in this particular case both its capacity to be an instrument of resistance and denouncement, and also a way of resignation and normalization. Thank you. I'm sorry I have too long, but
I know some of you will have to leave, some have, but we've got time for a few questions, so let's take advantage of the opportunity to speak with us. We have a wireless mic, so raise your hand and we'll get to you. Tell us your name and what you're studying as well.
Thanks, I'm James Perkins, I'm studying history, and my question has to do with if these units were ever brought back to the homeland during World War I and actually fought on the front, and if they had an impact on the whole culture there in the trenches and such, and if that had an extra benefits to it as well.
Yeah, it's a very important question. In the beginning, the military command didn't want to use them on the front. But as soon as the war expanded, more and more, above all in the civilian, the deputies or the civil politicians wanted to send more and more soldiers. In fact, they were shared in 2 parts. The smallest part was sent to the front, but most of them stayed in North Africa to go on with some work on the war industry. The idea was that the military command did not trust them on the front. They were afraid.
You mentioned how often these camps were normalizing these French society, way the worst parts of the underworld there. Were there's did you come across in your research more proactive attempts to kind of indoctrinate them into Republican ideals, or do you understand that question?
I understood the first part and not the second.
Was there in these camps? Were there many? Were there more proactive attempts by the heads of the camp to instruct the men, re-education?
At the beginning, yes, it was the idea at the beginning. At the beginning, there was really an idea of regeneration of this man by colonization, military values, but it quickly faded. And unfortunately, we can really say that for the end of 19th century, it just became a place of exclusion. That's also why, I come back to the former question, that's also why the experience of World War I was very important, because we were not, it was impossible to use them as soldiers. And after World War I, a lot of officers of the High Command realized that maybe it was not very useful to spend money, time, energy to keep so many men in this camp if it's a failure to use them. So after World War I, the movement progressively began to decrease because the awareness of their usefulness became more and more obvious.
In this country, there survives a romanticized notion of the French Foreign Legion. That's an active military fighting unit, at least in the collective unconscious that comes from cinema and novels. Is that different from this, or where does that come from? And is that a parallel institution because also as part of our romanticized notion of the French Foreign Legion, they're essentially criminals and people exported from the country that nobody wants to deal with.
No, you're completely right. It's a very important question. In fact, as you have seen, the imaginary of the Foreign Legion of Biribi is exactly the same. Of course, if we can, why did the French army create this corps? The Legion was created in 1832. Because at that time, we had no many units to send in North Africa. The situation in France, the political situation in France was very difficult. So we had to imagine new corps to the conquest of Algeria. And the African battalion or the French Legion were part of this special corps. And then, of course, you're right, it was very similar history and very similar destiny. Many soldiers who enlisted in the Foreign Legion came with other names or with no names from the Biribi. But I didn't want to include. In fact, I should have, but I didn't want to include the African nation because it's a huge world, and other people are now working in the U.S. and in France are working on the history of the Foreign Nation. But you're completely right. It's a very parallel and analog world, units and world.